All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us. We are about ready to get started with our presentation for tonight. Okay, welcome again. My name is Emily Parnell. I'm a park ranger with the National Park Service here in Boston. And on behalf of the National Park Service and Boston Harbor Now, I'd like to welcome you to the Underwater Archaeology of Boston. This is the third and final installment of our Revolutionary Harbor lecture series. This year, Revolutionary Harbor is presented as part of the commemoration of the Boston Harbor Island's 25th anniversary as a national park and 50th anniversary as a state park. To learn more about anniversary programs, you can visit our website at www.bostonharborislands.org. You can also find a link in the chat. The Boston Harbor Islands have an incredibly rich history to tell about the story of life on the edge of the continent. But these stories don't end on the shores of the islands. They can also extend underwater. Over the centuries, Boston Harbor has not been static. It's experienced changes in sea level and shifting sediments that have altered the land people have been able to visit. Areas where people once walked are now, in some cases, underwater, along with the material and environmental evidence of the lives the people of the past led. In addition, Boston has long been a hub for shipping and aquatic industry. With that comes its share of shipwrecks, submerged wharves, and more. Our guest tonight is David Robinson, the Director and Chief Archaeologist for the Massachusetts Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources. Prior to joining the state in 2019, he was president of the Rhode Island-based Submerged Cultural Resource Management consulting firm, David S. Robinson and Associates, Inc., and a marine archaeologist at the University of Rhode Island's Graduate School of Oceanography. Over the course of his 31-year career, David has specialized in multidisciplinary marine archaeological investigations of submerged shipwrecks, coastal infrastructure, and ancient cultural sites submerged by sea level rise. He's worked extensively with federal and state agencies, tribes, museums, and academic institutions around the US and abroad. David also served as Stellwagen Bank National Marine Sanctuary's first ever Marine Heritage representative on its Sanctuary Advisory Council between 2008 and 2014, and was appointed to and served as the Cultural Resources Representative on the U.S. National Marine Protected Areas Program's Federal Advisory Committee from 2017 to 2019. He is the 2019 recipient of the Tomaquag Museum's Eva Butler Scholar Award, recognizing his nearly 2 decades of collaborative marine archaeological work with Southern New England's indigenous communities. He holds an MA in anthropology with a focus in nautical archaeology from Texas A&M University and a BA in anthropology and art from the University of Rhode Island. We're excited to have David with us tonight. Before I let him take it away, though, we're going to address a couple housekeeping items. We're going to save audience questions until the end of the presentation, but anytime throughout the presentation, you're welcome to type questions into the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And if you're interested in closed captioning, you can use the CC button at the bottom of your screen to turn closed captions on or off. Lastly, we'd love to know where you're joining us from, so please feel free to drop your city and state into the chat. And that is all I have. So David, let's go ahead and dive in.
Dive in. I get it. That's great. Well, thank you so much, Emily, for that great introduction. And thank you to you and Brittany for inviting me to be one of the speakers at this year's Revolutionary Harbor lecture series. It's a real pleasure to be with everyone tonight. And I hope you enjoy the talk that I've put together. The underwater archaeology of Boston is a massive topic and is probably not something that we're going to be able to, well, I know for a fact I'm not going to be able to cover everything, and I'm not planning on covering everything that has to do with underwater archaeology in Boston. It's a massive, massive topic, and really, I think would best be suited to doing multiple talks that focus on specific aspects of the underwater archaeology of Boston, because it's nearly an overwhelming amount of archaeology that there is underwater here. So what I am planning on doing tonight is giving kind of a general overview of a lot of different aspects of the underwater archaeology that applies to Boston Harbor, with the hopes that it'll give us starting points for subsequent discussions, and also stimulate some questions that we can discuss at the end of the talk. So without further ado, let's get going. Okay, Emily gave me a great introduction. My background, as she said, I've been a marine archaeologist for 31 years. Most of that time was spent actually working as a consulting archaeologist, or a cultural resource management consultant. And I continued to do that right up until 2019, when I accepted the position as the director of the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources with the state of Massachusetts. But prior to that, I had been working up and down the eastern seaboard, from the mid-Atlantic up to the Canadian border, doing archaeological investigations that were related to basically to offshore development projects, so oil and gas, pipelines, electrical cables, dredging projects, wind farm projects, you name it. So I got a chance to really experience a lot of different archaeologies in different regions, but the majority of the work I did was in Massachusetts, and I did an awful lot of it in Massachusetts Bay and Boston Harbor. So I come from, I use this picture for my own introduction because it shows me doing something that I've loved ever since I was 3 years old and first put on a mask. I come from a family of divers. My father was a commercial diver. His great uncle that helped raise him was a Navy diver, and was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient for his work on the recovery of the U.S. submarine S4, and he also was the lead diver on the recovery of the S51. So diving is in the blood, and I've got 3 sons, and 2 of them are certified as scientific divers, and the third one, he's not a diver, but he certainly enjoys the water. So water is essential to my being, and go figure, I became an underwater archaeologist. And I have to say that as the underwater archaeologist for the state of Massachusetts, I feel so lucky to be in this position, to be able to serve all of you, and to help preserve the amazing underwater archaeological resources that we have in the state of Massachusetts. So the Board of Underwater Archaeological Resources, or BUAR, is a board that was formed in 1973 and is the sole trustee of the state's underwater cultural heritage. We are charged with encouraging the discovery, reporting, preservation, and protection of Massachusetts underwater archaeological resources. The board is comprised of myself and 9 members that are represent different facets of state government. We have the State Archaeologist's Office, the State Archivist's Office, the Director of DCR Waterways, the Director of CZM, Coastal Zone Management, the Chief of the Massachusetts Environmental Police, and the Executive Director of the Massachusetts Historical Commission, or their designees on our board, as well as 3 governor-appointed public members, 2 of which are representative of the recreational diving community in Massachusetts, and the other is a at-large marine archaeologist. Our jurisdiction is pretty massive. It extends to the coastal waters of the state, out to the federal water limits, and also includes all the interior waterways, rivers, ponds, lakes, streams, and even wetlands. So it's a huge area of responsibility. We issue permits for doing underwater archaeology in the state. And at the moment, I think we have 27 permittees. And these are folks that are people interested, avocational people, as well as commercial salvage companies and commercial archaeological companies and consulting archaeologists like I had been who work on environmental compliance projects. So it's a diverse group of permittees that we issue permits to, and an active group. There's a lot of underwater archaeology, marine archaeology going on in the Commonwealth. We do have a website, and I invite you to visit it at your leisure. It's got a lot of information on it about what we do at BUAR, the work we do, our permits and exemption requirements, the various laws and regulations that apply to underwater archaeology in the state. We have a list of what are known as exempted shipwreck sites, and these are sites that divers can dive on and actually do minor surface collection of artifacts from these sites. They're well-known sites that have been visited a lot, and are part of our exempted site system. We also have information on archaeological underwater preserves. We have one vessel that is in preserve at the moment. We also have information on some of the programs like our Shoreline Heritage Identification Partnership Strategy or SHIPS program that I'll talk about towards the end of the talk. And all the minutes from our public meetings are posted on the website. We also have a frequently asked questions section, number of policy guidance documents, list of the educational programs we do, our board membership, and a few links to different underwater archaeologically relevant sites and information on the Battle of Chelsea Creek. That was a study that was done by my predecessor, Vic Mastone, on the Revolutionary War battle that took place in Chelsea. I welcome all of you to reach out to me. I am your state underwater archaeologist. I would love to hear from you. And my contact information is on the website. It's really easy to find us. Just Google MABUAR and we'll pop up, and you'll see how to get a hold of me. So a good place to start probably is to kind of define what the underwater archaeological resources are that we're responsible for and that exist in the Commonwealth's waters. And these include a broad range of different types of resources, everything from indigenous watercraft like this log boat from Lake Quinsigamond near Worcester, and submerged sites, submerged landscapes that have been inundated by post-glacial sea level rise. This image to the right here is a 5,000-year-old landscape, and that's one of my indigenous research partners actually examining a tree stump in its growth position. This was taken in Rhode Island, but we do have landscapes and tree stumps in growth positions underwater in Massachusetts. Just don't have any pictures of it. And of course, underwater archaeological resources, most commonly, I think everybody thinks of these primarily, include shipwrecks, and also coastal infrastructure, things like this is a marine railway in East Boston. There's preserved along the coast in these urban waterfronts, quite a lot of old, primarily 19th century coastal infrastructure. We also have a number of aircraft wrecks submerged in our waters, and a lot of these are associated with World War II and training flights that were taking place around the state during the war. So it's a pretty diverse mix of resources, really. I mean, pretty much everything and anything that you can think of that would either float on the water, be next to the water, or have been submerged by rising water, or have crashed into the water from above. We've got it in our waters in the Commonwealth. So the talk tonight is focusing on primarily it's a Boston Harbor focused talk, and Boston Harbor is an exceptional location for archaeological resources. It's geographically it's the closest, largest port to Europe. as you're crossing the Atlantic. It's an area that was rich in, or is rich still in natural resources. It's a place that is a confluence of multiple rivers that connect with the ocean. So it was a convenient pathway for travel, for peoples living on these lands for thousands of years, not just since colonial and post-colonial times. It is, in some ways it's estuarine and an archipelago with all of its islands that are there. But the prominent features of the harbor are the kind of the outer harbor itself and all of its islands, including the Boston Harbor Islands National Recreation Area, the inner harbor over in here, and the rivers that feed into the harbor, the Mystic River, the Neponset River, Weymouth River, and the Ware River, and of course the Charles River that flows into the waters here. So just to, I think we are all familiar with the harbor, but and in terms of what constitutes the inner harbor and the outer harbor, it's designated here on this map. You can see the blue area going into the Mystic River is the inner harbor, and pretty much everything else is the outer harbor. And then you've got the approaches coming in from the north and the south. Probably the best place to start thinking and talking about underwater archaeology in the harbor is to begin thinking about the environment. And we as archaeologists, when we do archaeology, everything all the research that we do is always placed within an environmental context. And that context is not a static one in one specific time period, but over the entire time period that we suspect that there's going to be any kind of evidence of human activity within the areas that we're researching and we're studying. So in the case of Boston Harbor is very much a glaciated landscape, a landscape that was formed by glaciation. And the last glaciation at its maximum about 26,000 to 24,000 years ago, sea level globally was about 400 feet lower than it is today. And we had you look at this image here on the left, have the entire outer continental shelf was exposed land, and then the rest of it was north of the part that wasn't covered by ice was buried under a thick layer of ice. That layer of ice extended out to Nantucket, Martha's Vineyard, Long Island. Those islands are actually geological features, glacially formed features for the most part, known as terminal moraines. About 20,000 years ago, the ice began to retreat from Boston Harbor area and actually south of there, passing over the harbor sometime between about 16,000 and 14,000 years ago. So what this tells us is that from an archaeological standpoint, at least as far as we know from the archaeology that we've done to date, any people that were going to be on the landscape in Boston Harbor are going to post-date that retreat of the ice. There is, we know that there is indigenous oral histories that indicate a much earlier presence below where the glaciers extended down to. So there could be more ancient sites than we know of, but the retreat of the ice kind of creates a bit of a earliest kind of date, at least that we've seen thus far in the archaeological record, of about 14,000 for there being people here. And part of the reason for that is as this ice sheet was retreating, the northerly winds that blow across that glacier are very cold. So people aren't going to want to settle probably or occupy the lands that are very close to the glaciers, just because it's really going to be a cold, pretty unforgiving environment. The islands that you saw in the earlier figure, most of the islands, or all the islands in Boston Harbor, are what are known as drumlins. They're glacially formed. And you see the feature up here in this little schematic. It kind of shows you different types of glacial features. Here's an end moraine at the forefront of the glacier, its extreme limit. And then you have things called recessional moraines. If you think of the two forks of Long Island in New York, those are moraines, an end moraine and a recessional moraine that kind of crisscross each other. We also have braided channels and paleo channels that are in the sediments in Massachusetts Bay that were all formed as a result of the glaciers melting. Sea level, as I said, globally, it was about 400 feet lower at the peak of the last glaciation, but in Massachusetts Bay and the Gulf of Maine, because of the weight of the ice pressing down on the crust, it actually, when the ice started to retreat, the Earth's crust was depressed so that as the ice moved north, the ocean water and the ice were in contact for a time, and sea level was actually quite a bit higher, some almost 30 meters higher, at about 17 to 18,000 years ago than it is today. But then it dropped very rapidly. And if you look at this curve, the sea level rise curve, you can see the bottom numbers. This is time in thousands of years. So this is 17,000 years down at this end. So you can see it dropped very rapidly till about 13,500 years ago. And then it started to slowly rise again. And sea level rise is a complex interplay between crustal fluctuation and rebound and the water that's dumping into the world's oceans from the melting glaciers, causing the sea level to rise. There's this kind of dueling situation with the crustal rebound and sea level coming up that is what creates what's known as relative sea level rise. This is a relative sea level rise curve. So this is a series of images from the Boston Geology webpage showing about 9,000 years ago. Here's Boston Harbor. Here you can see that the shoreline was out quite a distance beyond the outer harbors, outer islands, out into Massachusetts Bay. But within about 3,000 years of that, you started to get incursions into the harbor, and then by about 3,000 years ago, most of the harbor was pretty well formed. These models are they're based on applying sea level rise curves to the existing bathymetry. They are not an exact, precise representation of how the shoreline was configured necessarily at all, because as sea level rises, of course, the effects of waves and currents has a massive impact on the landscape that's being inundated. So we know from our own experience today that as sea level rises increasing yet again, that it has pretty dramatic effects on the landscape. So what we end up seeing is when we look, this is a kind of a color-coded underwater topographic map showing the bathymetry, the underwater topography of Massachusetts Bay out in, or excuse me, of Boston Harbor out into Massachusetts Bay. The deeper water, so you get 35 meters deep here, and then you get 0 meters down here. So these bluer waters are all shallower than the water out here that's the reddish color. But in this submerged landscape that we can't see without special instruments that allow us to record water depth as swaths and then be able to map it. In these kind of plots, we can see things like these Paleo, Charles, and Mystic River channels that are still relic evidence of these old channels back from when this was a terrestrial landscape. You can also see the Paleo-Neponset River channel, a little bit of that here, the Paleo-Weymouth River channel going out through Nantasket Roads and coming around out of Hingham Bay, and then also a little bit of the Paleo-Ware River. So there are these residual elements of the old landscape that are preserved. And when we start to think about Boston Harbor is an archaeological problem, and where might we find inundated, formerly terrestrial, ancient indigenous sites, archaeological sites, we have to think about how's that landscape been altered by inundation. And so one of the early models that we used back in the early 2000s, when I first started looking at this issue, because of some projects that I was working on, we looked immediately at, well, what's going on with the sediments there? And so we looked at the USGS's data sets for the harbor, and we could see areas. They had mapped areas that were either exposed bedrock and had very strong acoustic reflections, or were erosional areas where there was gravel and lag that was visible, or there are areas that seem to be dynamic and moving around quite a bit, or the last category was areas that had depositional environments where sediment was actually accumulating. And so in the early modeling that myself and others did, we looked at these areas, and here you can see these are depositional areas that are highlighted in red in Boston Harbor. And we started to think about those areas as probably having the greatest potential for preserving ancient sites because they're not eroding, they're depositional, they're being covered in sediment. And so we assumed that would help protect these sites. And if we look at the models that we have for these paleo landscapes that were once exposed, like here you can see, and this is just a different way of looking at that sequence. The dark tan is the shoreline approximately 10,000 years ago. The slightly lighter tan is 6,000, and so on, 5,000, 3,000, and then to existing land. You can begin to look at the sedimentary record, and you can look at the kind of the preserved topographies and begin to think about this submerged landscape like a terrestrial landscape, and begin to apply what we know from archaeology on land to the underwater environment to think about where sites might be. And there certainly are going to be sites there. We've got an archaeological record in Massachusetts that dates back over 12,000 years. So people have been here, been in the Boston Harbor area and offshore for a very, very long time. And this is a very basic map of some of the major tribes in Massachusetts, key being here for the Boston Harbor area, the Massachusetts tribe, circa around 1630 at the time of early colonization in the area. But the presence of tribal people, it continues today, of course, and it's really a continuum that extends, well over 10,000 years. And that amount of time, from what we see in the archaeological record and what we know culturally of indigenous people of today, it is indicative of a very sophisticated, knowledgeable group of people that occupy this land for a very long time, as it changed climatically. But we see in the stone tools that are recovered evidence of a great knowledge of the different properties and locations for the best tools for making, or best stone for making stone tools. We also see evidence of really extensive and smart management of the resources, both on land and in the water. We see evidence of manufacturing of watercraft and of harvesting fish with fish farming technologies such as fish weirs, like you see in the picture here. We see some of the earliest stone tool evidence in the harbor islands and in the harbor out on Long Island, where what archaeologists know as an early archaic stone tool is found. This is a tool that dates to about 9,500 to 8,000 years ago. It was found in a secondary context off of Bass Point on Long Island. But this is an example of some of the very early evidence we have of archaeological evidence of people being out on the islands. And then we have evidence of shell middens, areas where obviously people were using the resources extensively, taking advantage of all the abundance that was there to survive and to feed themselves and to thrive. We see evidence of these shell middens on land along the presently eroding coast. Here you can see them as these little bits and pieces of white shell embedded in the soils that are being stripped away with rising sea levels and tides and storms. These resources, these sites, these cultural sites, sites that have importance from not because there's archaeological evidence or remains there, but because they have a cultural importance to today's native people and have for a very long time, did for their ancestors as well. These sites are all threatened by sea level rise. The new increase in sea level rise is happening today. And as a result of these impacts from erosion, but also from the responses to the erosion. So, things like offshore dredging of sands to replenish beaches, the installation of riprap barriers along the shore to help stabilize the shoreline, and even the more natural approaches. These all have potential impacts on the resources that are located along the coast. So right now, Massachusetts' maritime coastal heritage, both ancient indigenous sites and post-colonial sites, Euro-American sites, are all at risk, and shipwrecks too that are located along the coast. Boston is part of what we know today as the kind of the East Coast megalopolis, and it's at the head of that megalopolis. This megalopolis didn't it didn't develop overnight. This is, you can see in looking at, and the reason why I included this map in the presentation is you can see very clearly the hubs of the megalopolis are these port cities: Boston at the head to the north, New York, Philadelphia, and Baltimore. And these cities all developed and grew because of their connection to the water. And that connection to the water spans the entirety of the non-Indigenous history of the harbor. And as a result of that history, which we know goes back almost 500 years, when you have the first Iberian fishers that are seen caught on the Grand Banks end up getting blown towards the Massachusetts shore, and there's probably archaeological evidence somewhere of these people being here. But as the colony developed and industry developed, and more people immigrated to Massachusetts and Boston, the port of Boston really grew kind of explosively. And so in the course of our history, in the course of the colonial history and the history of the United States, pretty much every aspect of that development is represented in the archaeological record that is off our coast. And it should come as a surprise to any of us, I don't think, that we have approximately 3,500 reported vessel casualties in Massachusetts waters. Keep in mind that the majority of vessel sinkings aren't reported. So the number of vessel remains that exist off our coast is probably much higher than this number would indicate. And how do these ships end up on the seafloor? In a whole variety of different ways. They sink in storms, they get old and leaky or poorly maintained and sink, they blow up, they catch fire, they collide with other ships or submerged in floating obstructions, they run aground on shore and shoals and reefs, they get overloaded or the cargo shifts in rough weather and they flip over. Sometimes they're intentionally sunk during times of warfare, or if somebody's trying to scam their insurance company. Then they also get abandoned at the end of service life. And that's what happens with a lot of the vessels that we find, particularly in backwaters and intertidal areas. These are abandoned ships. They don't make the papers when they sink. They're just basically forgotten. There's an awful lot of those that we have along our coast. I did a study back in early to mid 2000s where I obtained BUAR's list of shipwrecks and tried to start to look at some big patterns in what was happening in the shipwrecks and around Massachusetts and also in Boston. And what I found was that there were patterns, and the three main areas that were reported as having shipwrecks were the Gloucester and Rockport area up to the north, Nantucket to the south, and then Boston kind of in the center there. And you can imagine why there's so many shipwrecks when you look at Cape Ann or Cape Cod or Nantucket. These are protrusions in the path of the ships that are traveling along the Massachusetts coast. So I think part of the reason why we've got so many wrecks for Boston is, or reported wrecks, is because that's where these vessels were actually headed. It's less so that because there's a lot of wrecks actually in Boston Harbor proper. As a result of doing this research, I also was able to conclude what the most common type of shipwreck was in Massachusetts waters, and this would apply to the waters of Boston Harbor and the outer harbor and approaches as well. And that's that these shipwrecks, the population of shipwrecks is been shaped by the local, regional, and national cultural and environmental conditions of the past. And I found that the average type of shipwreck in Massachusetts waters was an approximately 100-foot long by 300-ton wooden-hulled schooner dating from the second half of the 1800s. It was less than 20 years old at the time of its loss. It was probably carrying a cargo of fuel oil, coal, clay, limestone, lumber, timber, or fish. It was destined for one of the Massachusetts ports and then either stranded, burned, foundered, or foundered most likely during the winter or fall off the coasts of Gloucester, Rockport, Boston, and Nantucket. So it was, I did that study just to help sort of key me in on as to what the most commonly encountered wreck might be before I would go out to do the remote sensing surveys that we do to map the seafloor to try to identify both shipwreck sites and ancient paleo landscapes that might contain indigenous archaeological deposits. So the way that we look for sites offshore is we do these remote sensing surveys where we tow side scan sonars that paint a picture of the surface of the seafloor. And if there's anything that's anomalous on it, like a shipwreck, it will stand out. We also use what's called swath bathymetry, and that's some of those images that I showed you of the underwater topography. That's most often the instrument that we use to help record the data to create those models. And then we also use SubBottom Profilers to give us a sense of what's happening with buried lithologies and whether or not there's any elements of preserved paleo landscapes that are preserved under marine sediments on the seafloor. And then we it's not pictured here, but we use marine magnetometers to look for anomalous deposits of iron, like you might often have with a shipwreck site. And all the survey data is all tied into computers that are on board our survey vessels and all tied into GPS positioning, so we have very precise positions for where we find things on the seafloor. Finding shipwrecks is at least the more modern ones and the larger ones, is pretty easy. They do sort of stick out like a sore thumb from the surrounding seabed. What's a lot harder is finding the older ones that have become buried and that don't have a lot of preserved iron, so they don't have a magnetic signature. Sometimes you can see them in the SubBottom Profiler, but if the sediments are gassy, they become invisible. The profiler won't go through the gassy sediments, and so the older, more significant, and smaller vessels really are much harder to find. Finding areas where we might want to test to identify ancient indigenous sites, the SubBottom Profiler is our primary tool, and that gives us a cross-sectional view, like you see here, of sediments. And in this case, if we look at this record here, you can see the reflector. So this is like a cross-section of it's like when you cut a layer cake. You get the first reflector, which is the seafloor. Then you get a layer of marine sediments here. And then you got what's called a ravinement surface. That's an erosional surface that was impacted by the transgression or the movement of the wave face or the beach face as it moved landward, leaves behind gravelly lag deposits. And then these are old relic paleo channels, erosional features from when this was a terrestrial landscape. So when we look for evidence in this kind of data for where we might want to do additional subsurface testing to try to identify sites or identify areas that are sensitive and should be avoided when projects are being built offshore, we use this kind of data. We can use modeling packages to take that SubBottom data and then turn it into a three-dimensional landscape that just helps us visualize better where parts of the landscape may be archaeologically sensitive for ancient sites. And then we can also use coring in areas where projects are going to be excavated, like if they're going to put in a pipeline or a cable, we're going to excavate a trench. We'll make sure that we do some coring along that corridor to be able to ground truth the data we see in the SubBottom record. So we can open these cores, and it's like opening a book, and you can log their contents, and you can see the stratigraphy of the sediments and compare it to what you're seeing in the SubBottom record, and determine whether or not, if you do have an intact landform there, that has archaeological sensitivity. And we find extraordinary things sometimes in these cores. This light area that you see here is birch from a core that was taken in Nantucket Sound. That piece of birch is about 11,000 years old. You can see very distinctly an organic horizon that's associated with the surface of what turned out to be a deciduous forest floor that was about 10 miles offshore. We also find evidence of early Coltogens, like what you see here. This is essentially what we call today is quinoa, it's Chenopodium, things like grape seeds, and we can find little microscopic flakes of stone called microdebitage that if we don't find a full-size artifact, we can find these indicators of cultural presence in just the fine dust from the chipping of stone tools. These chips have very distinctive appearances to them. We also can dive and visually inspect portions of the seafloor. As divers, we can use remotely operated vehicles as well with high definition cameras and see exposed features, exposed parts of the landscape that we can then conduct archaeological investigations on. And as a result of the last almost 20 years worth of research, since we first started to look at depositional environments as being probably the most having the most archaeological potential for preserved sites, we've refined our understanding quite a bit as we found sites in situ and in cores and in the data that we collect, and have determined that the places where we most frequently are going to have preserved paleo landscapes that might have archaeological deposits in them is in what were topographic depressed areas or low areas that were protected from the energy of the wave face as it moved towards the shoreline, and that would either have flooded quickly or been buried quickly, so would be protected. One of the peculiarities of Boston Harbor is that it has extensive areas of what we call made land. And I'm just going to very quickly share with you a site that was discovered, a shipwreck site on land that had once been water. This is a map from 1835 showing the location of what is known as the Seaport Square shipwreck in Boston Harbor. But with the addition of made land, it became a terrestrial site, and now is in the Seaport District, or was in the Seaport District and was found when they were excavating to build a high-rise building. Somebody in one of the windows, one of the upper floors, one of the workmen was looking down at the excavation site and said, "Hey, what's that? That looks weird. That kind of looks like a ship." And sure enough, it was. The Public Archaeology Lab in Pawtucket, Rhode Island was brought in along with BUAR, my predecessor, Vic Mastone, and the Massachusetts Historical Commission were all consulted as to what to do about this wreck, and it decided that it couldn't stay, so it was fully documented prior to its removal. It was found to be carrying a cargo of lime, which is a very common cargo. It was one of those ones that I had identified in my research as being a common cargo. Looking at the artifact assemblage and the construction of the hull, we're able to determine that this vessel was probably a vessel that dated to the mid to earlier part of the 1800s and was likely what was known as a pinky schooner, and that was based on the foremast, which was way up front on the vessel, and also the very narrowness of the stern of the ship. So we're getting short on time here. So before I wrap things up, I just want to say that I definitely view this as like an initial discussion about Boston Harbor underwater archaeology. And I can imagine that future discussions might focus a little bit more on specific parts of the harbor and things that we found in the harbor to date. If for some reason you are out walking along the shore and you find something, we would very much like for you to report it to the board. And the best way to do that is to go to our website and download one of our ship's program reporting forms. It's a brief little form, easy to fill out. If you have any questions, email me and I'd be happy to walk you through it. If you're interested in knowing a bit more about archaeology in the Boston area and Massachusetts, I highly recommend checking out the Boston City Archaeologist's website. There's a lot of really great archaeology going on right now and has been for a long time in the city on land, mostly, but some of it's coastal and some of it's on the harbor islands. The Massachusetts Archaeological Society also has a website and a museum, the Robbins Museum in Middleborough, Mass. I highly recommend you check them out. The MHC, or the Massachusetts Historical Commission, has a website with archaeological exhibits online. It's a really great website, and they also have a general Massachusetts archaeological part of the page that is really good too. And then, of course, every October is Massachusetts Archaeology Month. With the pandemic, we have not had much of an archaeological month in the last couple of years, but I think we're hoping to have a good one this year in 2022. So with that, I will say thank you and be happy to answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, David. That was a fascinating presentation, and I know, at least me, I'm excited to hear more in the future and learn more about this subject. And maybe right now with some questions from folks who are in attendance. If anybody does have questions that you haven't entered yet, feel free to throw those in the Q&A. There's a button for that at the bottom of your Zoom window. So to get started, David, Edward in the audience wants to know if there are any British shipwrecks in the harbor that you know of.
Well, there's certainly reports of British shipwrecks in the harbor, but to date, the evidence of these wrecks is pretty elusive. There's a British wreck the Magnifique that has been a topic of interest for a long time, but there are indicators that probably it was destroyed by dredging. And that's one of the peculiarities of that map that I showed of the made land. If you think about it, all the coastal infrastructure, the earlier coastal infrastructure, and a lot of the vessels that would have been abandoned along shore are now, they're under land. And so those earlier ships are, uh, if they're going to exist, they're going to have to be ships that sank while they were coming in and out of the harbor. There's also there's a British ship, the HMS Diana, that was captured by American forces in Chelsea Creek and stripped and burned. We've got a permittee who's very interested in trying to find that. So those are the ones that come to mind immediately.
Great. Early on in your presentation, you were showing a map of the harbor and some of the different pathways through it. And Donna noticed that President's Rose looked like it had a very deep hole in it. Is there anything geologically going on there that you can speak to?
Yeah, I mean, from my looking at that map as well, it looks like these are areas that, and I think of my home state of Rhode Island, the east passage of Narragansett Bay, which is very deep, almost 200 feet deep, is much deeper than the west passage. And it's because as the glaciers were melting, they were following this path of an old paleo channel. And then as the glaciers were melting, it scarred out an even deeper one. So that area of President's Roads and that old paleo channel that you see there, that's an old geologically formed feature. That's why it's deeper there. So that's an area where you just must have had a lot of glacial meltwater dumping in and eroding out the seafloor there.
So cool. Lisa would like to know if any of the artifacts, the materials that you've uncovered are available to view by the public.
So I didn't mention this, but the BUAR, we do have a fairly small artifact collection. We also have a research library and a lot of files, a lot of shipwreck files, and a GIS-based database that is in a draft format now that we've been creating to inventory the wrecks in Massachusetts waters. We are in the process. The offices have been closed because of COVID to the public, but once things get back to real normal, people can come in and access, they can meet with me, can access the collections that we have in the books and our files. For the most part, there's some that are kept confidential, but majority of it's all accessible, and certainly would welcome anybody to come in and say hello and look at our stuff.
Great. You were talking earlier about the bathymetry. That was a new word for me. And one of our participants said, looking at the bathymetry data, the Boston Main Channel and the Inner Harbor Channel have been dredged. So are we seeing a mix of paleo rivers and human activity? How do you distinguish between the two, and can you make that distinguishment?
Yeah, that's a great question. You actually can. The quality of when I first started doing remote sensing survey, it was in the days prior to computing, the pre-digital days, and so we had paper records. But with digital technology, it's what's made the biggest difference in us understanding the seafloor, I think, in a pretty high level way, because of the ability to visualize the data in a way that we weren't able to before. I mean, I literally used to have to roll sonar records and magnetometer records in parallel to create mosaics of the data, and then walk along, looking down on the floor and looking at the data. Now we can create these incredible shaded models and fly through these bathymetric landscapes to see what's going on. And with dredging, it's very clear areas that have been dredged versus areas that are natural. And it's based on the surface. Dredged areas usually have very abrupt and kind of straight angular types of cuts in the sediments, whereas the natural channels, they're much more gradual, and you can see that they're created by the flow of water.
All right. Alan wants to know if there are any sites or shipwrecks that you'd like to find but haven't been able to yet.
Ooh, these are good questions. I think I don't know. I've never really been super motivated by hunting for a thing. What I would like us to be able to identify more extensively than we have and further offshore are the ancient indigenous sites, because we really know so very little about those sites and even the paleo landscapes that they're in. This is a part of underwater archaeological research that has really grown and started to develop in just the last 20 years. And to a large extent in the United States anyway, it started in Massachusetts with the work that we did 20 years ago for the Hub Line pipeline project and went through Massachusetts Bay and into Boston Harbor. But it's to really nail down a solid understanding so that we can do a better job of predicting where these sites are and protecting them from impacts from offshore development. That's really what I hope for before I retire.
Great. We talked a little bit about climate change, sea level rise, and we know that the city of Boston and some other organizations have discussed possibly building some sort of storm barrier in the harbor. Is that a project that you and other underwater archaeologists have had any collaboration with or could see yourselves working on?
In addition to us, to BUAR permitting projects, in addition to us doing outreach and studying sites, managing sites, we also review all the offshore projects that require environmental review. We have to review those projects to assess whether or not they need a survey, whether a survey needs to be done if they have archaeological cultural sensitivity. And that's about 1,500 projects a year that we look at in Massachusetts. So a project like a wall around Boston Harbor would definitely be something that we would be involved in the review of and commenting on, and certainly would be probably have a pretty large footprint in terms of its impact that would have to be investigated by consulting archaeologists. Yep. But to date, I have not been involved in that discussion.
Kind of in a similar vein, Josephine wants to know if there was any underwater archaeology component involved with the Big Dig project, and if you know of any interesting artifacts that came out of that.
Well, I know because I've been to the lab and seen the collections at the Boston City Archaeologists facilities, I know some amazing artifacts came out of the Big Dig project. In terms of underwater archaeology being done for the Big Dig, that was before my time working for BUAR by quite a lot, and it was not anything. I was not involved in any marine archaeological survey for the Big Dig. I don't recall there being any.
Sounds good. Let's see. Phil has identified or has seen a vessel that's visible at low tide in Chelsea Creek by the Irving and Global Dock, and was wondering if you're familiar with that one.
Yeah, there's actually, I think there's 4 vessels that are in the creek there. And we have a current permittee. He's had a permit for, well, since 2006, and he has made some beautiful photo mosaics of the wrecks and done. He's right now he's really starting to dig into the archival research and also looking at one of them for evidence as to whether or not it dates from the Revolutionary War and could be the Diana. But we don't know yet. He's still doing the research. But yeah, we are aware of those wrecks.
Let's see. Lisa wants to know if LiDAR is a tool that you use or can use to facilitate your work. And if so, are there any advantages or disadvantages to it?
Yeah, so LiDAR is something that I have not used in any of the work that I have done, but it is something that I know for sure has applicability for coastal adjacent sites, so land sites. And I've heard discussions, but I've not seen the results from aerial LiDAR surveys of clear, shallow water that can penetrate. The light can penetrate through the water, so you can actually see something on the bottom. That's always our problem here in the Northeast and southern New England. The underwater visibility lots of times isn't very good, and so you don't get good light penetration. That's why we depend so much on sound and acoustic instrumentation, because it's not impacted by turbidity of the water. It can ping. So the side scan sonars that we use to paint a picture of the seafloor, it doesn't matter that the water is clear or not. It can see. These are great questions. Thank you so much, everybody.
Yeah, we know that right now there are a lot of dredging projects going on in the harbor. And one of our attendees wants to know if there were any archaeological investigations prior in conjunction with that, or if it was an area that had already been dredged.
Yeah, so when we coordinate and work a lot with the Army Corps of Engineers and also with CZM on dredging project review. And so the Corps has great records for project areas, and they know where they've dredged in the past. So in most instances, if it's an area that's been dredged before, and in particular, if it's been dredged all the way down to what we consider to be pretty culturally sterile, Boston blue clay, the clay that was deposited when the glaciers and the water, as the glaciers retreated, were in contact, and you had this glacial melt water pouring off the glaciers that had this very fine silt in it that created this stratum of Boston blue clay. When they're dredging down to that stuff, the chances of us having anything that's cultural there are pretty minimal. If it's something that hasn't been dredged in a long time, though, because they've been dredging in Boston Harbor for forever, and it could be that a vessel that's 50 years or older has been deposited, then that would be something that could potentially be historically significant. So we always look at the projects and try to assess what the potential is for there to be resources that are going to be impacted. And we also recognize that sometimes the dredging removes the marine sediment overburden that is blanketing a potential paleo land surface. So I always take a look at the cores that are done prior to the dredging projects to see if there's any evidence of that kind of stratigraphy that could be important to investigate before there's any dredging done.
All right, we have a couple questions about public involvement with underwater archaeology. So first of all, I want to know if people can actually go down and explore the underwater wrecks along the harbor.
Absolutely. All the underwater, all the shipwrecks in Massachusetts waters are open to the public. The public is the most important steward of all these resources. I view the diving community in particular as one of the most important constituencies that BUAR works with, because they're the folks that are going out to these sites with regularity, that have many of them have a really passionate interest in underwater archaeology and history and technology, and a lot of them, we're seeing more and more divers doing technical diving so they can reach very deep wrecks, and also investing in remote sensing equipment so they go out and do surveys. So the wrecks are absolutely open to be dived on. They're there for everybody to enjoy. The only stipulation is that, other than for the exempted wrecks, and even for them, I always feel like if people are removing artifacts from the wrecks, after a while, there's not as much to look at. So the greatest harm is done, I think, to the diving community who visits these things with regularity. If people are removing things, then there's not as much to enjoy from the wrecks. And the argument that I've heard people use counter to that is that, well, if we don't take them, if we don't bring them up, nobody's going to see them, nobody's going to enjoy them, and these shipwrecks are just going to go away and be lost forever. Well, I can see some of the point in that for sure. I mean, but we know from archaeological research that's been done now for 50 plus years, underwater research, that there's shipwrecks that are thousands of years old. So the ones that are hundreds of years old, they may not be above the surface of the seafloor anymore, but their buried components will have the potential to last for a very long time. And so the less disturbed they are, the longer they're in the archaeological record and available to people to investigate in the future.
Amazing. For folks who are not able to go dive and see these underwater resources, but maybe walking along the beach somewhere, what kind of artifacts might they come across if that were to happen? What should they be looking for?
Yeah, it really depends where you are. Environment really is everything. If you're walking along the waterfront around Boston or around some of these older harbor areas, you're likely to see some old coastal waterfront infrastructure that is being actually flooded and inundated by sea level rise. If you're out on the outer Cape, you're more likely to encounter bits and pieces and big chunks sometimes of ships' hulls that have been broken up and scattered on the beach. This is part of the reason why the Park Service, your Park Service, is adopting what's known as the stamp program, where they're affixing tags to the remains of ships that can be scanned by citizen scientists with a cell phone, and the location of the ship part documented, because we're starting to realize in states where they've had the stamp program and have been tracking ship parts, that these things move, in some cases across state lines. These pieces of ship, they float, they get transported by the waves and the currents and the wind, in ways that we don't fully understand. So yeah, it depends where you are along the coast. You're going to find different things. If you're walking along a protected old estuarine area along marshes, you're more likely, I think, to find things like ancient native sites, shell middens. You're more likely to see evidence of very organic deposits that are being exposed by erosion that are part of that old paleo landscape. You might find tree stumps. If anybody finds anything like that, if you find tree stumps sticking up out of the seabed or out of the intertidal, please get a hold of us. We'd be extremely interested in seeing something like that.
All right, and we are running short on time now, so I'm going to ask one last question. This is from Cynthia. They want to know, where can we read more about the current findings?
Well, if you go onto the BUAR webpage and you look at the public meetings information page, there are minutes of every one of our board meetings going back quite a few years. Eventually, I hope to have all the meetings on the website, but we've got a lot of them. In those minutes, yeah, there's a lot of boring kind of board business stuff, but there's a lot of discussion about, and it's kind of summarized. It's brief, so you can get, if you read through some of those, you can get a really pretty good sense of kind of what's going on and what the various permittees are doing, the kind of things that they're working on, the sites they're seeing. You can always email me. I'd be happy to provide periodic updates. I'm beginning to think that it might be like I almost need to take more advantage of social media and start to post something regularly so that people would know. And I'm glad that question was asked because it's making me think something I definitely have to do. Let's see what else. Where are other good places to see what's going on? I give talks all the time, so be on the lookout for presentations by BUAR staff. That'll be me giving a talk. The Massachusetts Archaeological Society, they have multiple chapters throughout the state. They have regular meetings and they always have guest speakers, and underwater archaeology is often a topic. I'm not the only underwater archaeologist working in the state. There's several of us. So stay tuned, be looking, Googling underwater archaeology Massachusetts, and check out our website. And that should key into most of what you want to know.
Great. Look forward to hearing some more. We do have a bunch of questions that unfortunately we didn't get to tonight, but David, we will pass those along to you if you don't mind taking a look at them, and then we can hopefully get some answers to people as a follow-up to this presentation.
Absolutely. I'd be really happy to see what they are and happy to answer them, you know, because of the isolation that we've all been living through for the last couple of years. Human interaction is really nice. And I'd very much like to hear from everybody. It's great. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you so much for joining us, David. And also thank you to everyone who tuned in for this event. This was our final portion of 2022's Revolutionary Harbor Lecture Series. If you'd like to rewatch this presentation, or if you had to jump in late, want to catch any part that you missed, as well as view any of our other previous virtual programs, you can visit the Boston Harbor Islands YouTube page, and tonight's recording will be available in the next coming weeks. And as we move out of the virtual world and closer to being back on our beloved islands, we'd also like to invite you to save the date for the opening day of Boston Harbor Islands this year, which is Saturday, May 21st. We're very excited to see you all then. Keep an eye on bostonharborislands.org on the calendar there for more information as we continue to celebrate our very special anniversaries that are happening this year. Links to those are in the chat. Thank you all so much for being here tonight, and we hope to see you on the islands this season. Have a good evening.